He wasn't supposed to survive the prophecy, much less become it. They said the Sci-Fi would choose only once. That when the ash returned, the one bearing the forgotten mark would rise, or the world would fall. No one expected it to be him. Not the village. Not the elders. Not even Darren himself. But as the cloud devoured the sky and ancient powers awoke beneath his skin, one truth became impossible to ignore. When he stepped into the storm and raised his hand, the stars themselves seemed to hesitate before the light erupted from his chest and tore the darkness apart. And when it was over, he was no longer just a man. He was memory. He was myth. He was the beginning of something the universe had waited lifetimes to remember. The cold had teeth. It bit through the thin air of Eloria's highlands with a kind of ancient hunger, threading between shattered stone pillars and skeletal trees, whispering old names into the wind, names no human ever knew. Darren Holt moved slowly, boots crunching over crystal-coated soil, each step echoing into silence. The twin moons hung like solemn eyes above, and the forest below didn't sleep. It listened. He hadn't expected to survive the crash. The wreckage of the drop ship lay somewhere behind him, swallowed by vines and glowing moss. The emergency beacon was dead, the comms jammed by atmospheric static, and the planet's geography didn't match any chart he remembered. Darren was, for all practical purposes, a ghost now. But ghosts didn't feel cold, and tonight, the cold was sinking into his bones. That's when he reached into his pack and pulled it out. The jacket. Old recon standard. Deep blue, worn threadbare, patched in places with whatever cloth he could find in field kits long expired. The left chest still bore the faded insignia of the 17th spiral and 3 stars, stitched in golden thread. The symbol hadn't meant anything in years. Not since the war ended. Not since most of his unit stopped coming back. He shrugged it on. The fabric was stiff from age, but it held a kind of weight that grounded him, like slipping into an older version of himself, a man who once believed orders meant purpose and that saving lives was enough to quiet the screams at night. He didn't hear her approach. Not at first. The crack of a brittle twig brought his hand instinctively to the grip of his sidearm. He turned, heart steady, pupils narrowing. And there she was. Half-formed by firelight, like a breath-given shape, tall, lithe, skin shimmering like molten quartz beneath the flicker of his flames. Her eyes pale violet, rimmed with a shimmer that danced between color and light, locked onto his chest, not his face. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and then, she dropped to her knees. The wind held its breath. Her voice trembled, but it cut through the quiet like a blade. "The sigil of Sci-Fi," she whispered. "You are the one?" Darren didn't move. He blinked once. Slowly. She wasn't armed. No armor, no tech, just tribal cloth, bone charms that jingled gently against her collarbone, and the unmistakable air of someone staring at a miracle. Or a memory. "I think you've got the wrong guy," he muttered, lowering the pistol but not releasing it entirely. "It's just a uniform." She reached toward him, hesitating, her fingers hovering just inches above the emblem stitched to his jacket. There was reverence in her motion, and something older. Fear? "Ah. Only the air would wear it," she said, her voice barely audible. "The one from the stars. With fire in his veins. With a light to break the ash." The phrase hit something in Darren he didn't know was there. He stiffened. "This?" He looked down at the patch. "This used to mean forward reconnaissance. Nothing holy about it." She looked up then, finally, and her expression was cracked wide open, hope fighting grief, disbelief tangled with some desperate kind of recognition. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked. "Remember what?" "That symbol came from our world." He should have dismissed her. Chalked it up to superstition or some local folklore misaligned with reality. But something deep in her tone wouldn't let go. She wasn't lying. Not deluded. She knew. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of cold metal and something older, ozone and bone. He gestured toward the fire, and she sat, warily but without fear, across from him. "Eloians?" he asked. She shook her head. "My tribe is called the Vialtari. We do not speak our true name aloud. Not since the Cloudfall." "Cloudfall. The ash that eats the sky," she murmured. He stared at her, then back to the dark forest around them. The stars had vanished behind drifting clouds, slow, creeping tendrils that looked almost sentient. "I don't know what kind of story you think I belong in," he said, voice lower now, "but I'm not your savior." She said nothing. Just watched the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them over her knees. Darren stared into the flames too, and for a moment, he felt something strange stir in the back of his mind. A memory that wasn't his. A face. A scream. A promise spoken through static and light. Then it was gone. "I'm Lyrie," she said finally. He didn't answer at first. Then, Darren. Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, something heavy, inevitable. In the forest beyond, something howled. And high above, hidden in the clouds, something ancient began to stir. They traveled in silence. The path wound through jagged arches of violet stone, the air charged with a quiet hum that tickled the edges of thought. Crystals jutted from the canyon walls like frozen lightning, pulsing faintly with inner light that shifted as they passed first blue, then red, now gold. The further they walked, the less Eloria felt like a planet and more like something alive. Watching. Listening. Lyrie walked ahead, her long steps sure, though her bare feet moved over razor-sharp terrain. She never looked back, but she didn't have to. Darren followed, uncertain, one hand brushing the hilt of his sidearm more out of habit than intent. It wasn't fear that kept him quiet. It was that unplaceable pressure in the air. The kind that whispered not with sound, but memory. He should have turned around. He should have found shelter, fixed the transmitter, waited for evac. But something in Lyrie's voice, something in the way the wind seemed to shift when she said, "You are the one," he couldn't shake it. They reached a narrow cleft between two monoliths, and she pressed her hand against the wall. The stone responded. With a deep rumble, the cliff split, revealing a sloping passage, carved not by hands but by time and something more deliberate. Inside, the light changed again, no longer moonlight but a soft, phosphorescent glow, coming from threads of crystalline vines running through the walls like veins. Darren said nothing, but his pulse had started to climb. They entered a chamber the size of a cathedral, hollowed from rock, with vaulted ceilings and smooth, glistening walls. Shapes moved in the shadows, tall figures, cloaked in thick gray robes, faces obscured by translucent masks of stone. The elders. They stood in a half-circle, motionless as statues, yet their presence pressed inward like gravity. Lyrie bowed low. Darren hesitated, then inclined his head slightly. The silence was broken by a low voice, one not from any throat, but from somewhere deeper. It spoke not in sound, but in meaning. A projection into the mind. "You wear the mark. But do you carry the light?" Darren's mouth was dry. "I'm not who you think I am." One of the elders stepped forward. Beneath the mask, pale eyes shimmered. Slowly, he turned and gestured toward the back of the chamber, where the wall curved inward into a dome. Carved into the stone were symbols etched with fire, layered with time. Spirals. Wings. Stars. The same emblem that sat stitched on Darren's chest. But larger. Older. The elder's hand rose. And then the wall itself began to move. Not mechanically, organically. Like stone shifting under breath. A panel opened, revealing a deeper space beyond. Darren stepped forward. And froze. The room beyond was a shrine. A temple. Its walls covered in mural after mural, ancient yet vivid scenes painted in glowing inks that shimmered like starlight when they caught the breath of the cave. A figure stood at the center of each image, humanoid, tall, clad in unfamiliar armor. Light blazed from his hands. Around him, Aliens knelt. The ash cloud loomed in the distance, dark, serpentine, devouring forests and skies. And then, in the final mural, the figure raised a spiral of fire, and the cloud broke apart. Darren's throat tightened. "That's not possible," he murmured. "We weren't here. Humanity hadn't even reached this system." Lyrie stepped beside him, voice barely above a breath. "The one who came did not arrive by ship. He fell from the stars, wounded, lost, and still, he gave us light." She pointed to the last carving. The figure's chest bore the exact insignia Darren wore. Not similar. Identical. He backed away, hands raised, as if proximity could make it more real. This doesn't make sense. This is some kind of mistake. You're connecting symbols that don't belong together. Another elder stepped forward, eyes flickering. We remember in flame, not ink. The mark is passed in the blood of starlight. You are not a mistake. You are the echo. Darren shook his head. His skin prickled. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat. To push back. But he didn't move. Instead, a question rose in him, quiet, unwelcome. What if they were right? He remembered Captain Reing. 22 years ago. Mission went south. Shuttle crash. Reing was the only survivor. And when they found him weeks later, he was different. Not broken. Not wounded. Different. Calm. Empty-eyed. He had said only one thing before he retired in silence. I saw light where death should have been. Darren stared at the symbol on the wall again. It wasn't just a unit patch. Not anymore. You're reaching, he said quietly. You want to believe I'm someone I'm not? Lyrie looked at him, eyes soft. We don't believe because we want to. We believe because we must. In the distance, a low rumble echoed through the cavern. A tremor, subtle, but unmistakable. The elders turned their heads upward, toward the source. One of them whispered, more to the stone than to those present. It has returned. Darren turned toward Lyrie. What's coming? Her expression dimmed. The ash cloud, she said. The one the first Skyborn drove away. The one that cannot be killed, only held at bay. She looked at him then, not like a savior. Not like a god. Like a man she hoped wouldn't run. And Darren didn't move. Outside, the wind began to howl. And the sigil on his chest, for the first time in decades, pulsed with a dull, golden warmth. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came with silence. Not the kind of silence that soothes, but the kind that presses against the ears until your breath sounds too loud and your heartbeat feels like a betrayal. The forest had stopped speaking. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. Just the hum beneath the ground, deep, pulsing, ancient. Darren stood at the cliff's edge, eyes fixed on the horizon. Where once there had been silver blue skies and the fractured shimmer of twin suns, now there was nothing. A wall of dark mist crawling across the land, slow but inevitable, devouring color as it moved. It wasn't smoke. Smoke didn't bend light. This did. What is that? He asked, though the answer trembled already at the back of his mind. Lyrie stepped beside him. Her voice was flat, but her fingers curled tight against her robes, nails digging into her palm. The ash cloud. The name didn't do it justice. This wasn't ash. It wasn't fog. It was something that lived. It moved with intention, stretching like liquid shadow across the treetops, pouring between valleys. Trees withered in its wake. Stones cracked. The sky dimmed above it, the stars vanishing one by one. Darren felt it before it touched him. A ripple, subtle, brushing the edge of thought. A pulling. As if something was trying to reach into him, not through flesh but memory, touching who he was, not what he was. He stepped back. It doesn't just destroy, Lyrie said quietly. It unweaves. Unweaves. Who you are. What holds you together. It steals not your life, but your story. Darren's mouth was dry. He had seen death before. War. Fire. Bone. But never this. Never a thing that erased your existence and left no trace that you'd ever been. He turned to her. You said it comes every few generations? She nodded once. And every time, the stories grow thinner. Fewer survive to tell them. The last time, the first one stood in its path and held it back. He looked out again. The cloud was faster now. Rolling over hills like liquid dusk. Swallowing. Consuming. And now. She didn't answer. Instead, she took his hand. Her skin was cool. Smooth like glass, but beneath it he felt something strange, like faint pulses of light moving through veins that weren't quite there. We have to go, she said. There's something you need to see. She led him away from the village, past walls carved with ancient words he couldn't read but somehow understood. Through ravines that pulsed with living roots. And then, into a canyon where the air thinned, and the silence grew heavy. Ahead stood a gate half buried, hidden beneath layers of rock and crystal. Not natural. Forged. Its surface was black and smooth, etched with the same spiral and star symbol now fading on Darren's chest. As they approached, the gate responded, groaned again, and parted with a breath that felt more like release than opening. They stepped inside. It wasn't a temple. It was older than belief. A vault of light and stone, walls lined with relics, machines dormant for centuries, their purpose lost. At the center stood a pedestal. Not grand. Just waiting. A simple stone surface, and atop it, a capsule the color of burnt gold, smooth as river-worn glass, humming faintly. What is that? He asked. Riing's legacy, Lyrie answered, almost in a whisper. Darren froze. That name. Captain Riing? My C.O. He came here. Not by design. He fell, like you. But he left this behind. And only the air of his mark can awaken it. She motioned to the capsule. The symbol glowed softly on its lid, the same spiral that had haunted Darren for days. He stepped forward. His breath shook. As his fingers touched the capsule, the surface rippled under his skin. Warmth flooded his veins. Not burning. Something else. Recognition. Like the device had been waiting for him, for years. Decades. Lifetimes. The capsule hissed open. Inside was a device. Compact. Curved. Neither weapon nor tool, at least, not as he understood them. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The moment he touched it, it came alive. Golden light burst outward. The spiral ignited, wrapping around his forearm, threads of energy weaving up his skin, under it, into it. He gasped, knees buckling, vision dimming as memories not his own flickered behind his eyes. Riing standing here, alone, blood on his hands, whispering a name he never remembered. Darren collapsed. The device didn't fall. It stayed wrapped around his arm, fused with him now, like a second skin made of living light. Lyrie knelt beside him, her eyes wide not with fear, but something closer to awe. You've awakened it, she said. He tried to speak, but couldn't. The energy inside him pulsed again, and with it came a flood of feelings not his own. A deep grief. A promise broken. And under it all, a question. Are you willing to finish what he could not? Outside, the ash cloud reached the edges of the cliffs. And the world, once more, held its breath. The relic didn't hum, it breathed. Darren stood before it, half lit by the pale pulse of embedded crystal veins that crawled like frozen lightning across the walls of the chamber. The air was heavy, not just in pressure, but in meaning. It was like standing inside the chest of a sleeping god. The kind of stillness that precedes revelation or annihilation, and maybe both. The device rested atop a slab of obsidian etched with concentric circles that shimmered when he stepped closer. No dust. No erosion. No signs of time. As if the room had sealed itself from the decay of centuries, preserving this moment like the universe had been waiting for him to arrive. Not a second early. Not a breath late. Lyrie stood to his left, silent, eyes trained on the object. Her voice barely broke the tension. It only responds to blood touched by the sky fire, she said. What does that mean? He asked, though his voice barely sounded like his own. Her gaze met his, and in it was something deeper than knowledge. Pain. Hope. Fear. Worship. Touch it, and you'll know. Darren's hand lifted. Not by force. Not by decision. It was instinct. Gravity. Memory. And as his fingertips brushed the cold surface of the relic, the world changed. The device pulsed once like a heartbeat skipping, and golden light bled from its seams, not outward but inward, pulling into him, unraveling into his nerves, threading through muscle, bone, marrow. It wasn't pain. It was something far more dangerous. Recognition. He staggered, knees buckling. Lyrie reached for him, but stopped watching instead, breath caught. Images. Not images, echoes. Thoughts, fractured and bright, spiraled through him like old songs half remembered. A battlefield of violet sand. A tower of living glass cracking under the weight of fire. A voice, calm and worn, whispering a name he didn't know but felt carved into his spine. He saw Ring. Not as the man he remembered. Not the gruff, gray-eyed captain who barked orders from behind cracked visors. This memory was younger, dressed in the same tattered uniform, but his eyes glowed with something that wasn't human. Not fully. Ring was kneeling beside the same relic, blood running from his nose, whispering a phrase over and over in a language Darren didn't speak but understood. Forgive me. Let him carry it forward. The connection broke like shattering glass. Darren fell, gasping, hand still locked to the device now latched to his arm like it had grown there. Golden bands spiraled from wrist to elbow, glowing with pulses of soft light that seemed synced to his heart. They moved when he breathed. Lived with him. Lyrie knelt beside him, her hand brushing his cheek, eyes wide not with fear, but something else. Reverence. It chose you. No, he rasped. It remembered me. Behind them, the chamber began to shift. The symbols on the walls ignited with fireless glow. Gears that hadn't turned in generations stirred. And high above, a sound soft, hollow like the planet exhaling for the first time in centuries. Something old had awakened. And it was inside him now. The warmth from the device spread beyond his arm. Into his chest. His spine. His mind. He felt the world more clearly, could hear the distant scream of wind miles away, sensed the tremble of stone under pressure. His eyes sharpened. Thoughts snapped into place. Emotions rose like tides under a full moon, impossible to stop or name. He looked at Lyrie. She reached for him again, but paused, watching the change unravel across his face. What's happening to me? He whispered. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She only bowed her head and whispered a single phrase. The legacy remembers its heir. And outside, the ash cloud crept closer. As if drawn to the light. The ash didn't roar. It whispered. It crept along the ridge like a shadow pretending to be fog, black tendrils slithering through the roots of the ancient trees, curling around trunks, melting bark into ash. The sky dimmed as if swallowed whole, stars blinking out one by one, not hidden, consumed. The village bells rang out, not in rhythm, but panic. Sharp, broken, desperate. Children screamed. Elders fell to their knees and wept before statues that had long since lost their names. And overhead, the first line of the cloud touched the outer wall, and everything it touched unraveled. Stone didn't crack. It dissolved. Wood didn't burn. It forgot itself. Darren felt it before he saw it. The pressure in his bones. The pulling at the back of his eyes. The device on his arm pulsed with warning, the golden spiral now alive, radiating warmth that bordered on pain. He stood in the center of the square, heart drumming a hollow rhythm in his chest. Around him, Aloians gathered, not behind him but beside him. Men with trembling spears. Women holding infants close. Lyrie moved like fire between them, directing, calming, not through words but presence. The ash reached the boundary line. Something inside him shifted. His breath caught. The device responded. There was no thought, just movement. Light burst from his arm, wild and golden, not a beam but a bloom. It poured outward, then curved, then expanded, wrapping him in a cocoon of memory made real. The shield formed like a dream, silent, fluid, alive. It shimmered with images, faces, moments, pieces of him flickering in the golden haze. His first sunrise on earth. The taste of ration coffee. Ring's voice calling his name in the snow. His sister laughing, though he couldn't remember why. The ash slammed into the shield. And screamed. Not sound, but vibration. Every bone in his body rattled. The villagers flinched as the cloud recoiled, its front edges folding back like a wounded animal. But it wasn't gone. It reared. Tested. Then lunged again. Darren held his ground. The light surged from his chest, through his arms, into the spiral. Each pulse pushed the ash back, but it pulled something with it. He could feel it. Thoughts. threads of himself unraveling with each clash. His memories weren't just on display, they were being spent. He staggered. Lyrie ran to him, her hands grasping his shoulder. "You must rest." "I can't," he said, voice tight. "If I drop it, they'll die." She looked into his eyes, saw the truth there, and did not argue. The cloud hissed, recoiled, then surged forward with new force. It slammed the shield with a shockwave that knocked the crowd to their knees. Darren screamed not from fear, but from the weight. The shield bent. Cracked. His mind flooded with visions that weren't his Ring's final stand, the temple burning, the sky falling like glass. Then it happened. The device cracked along one line, and something changed. The spiral deepened, brightened, then wrapped around his chest like a second spine, embedding into skin, leaving trails of molten gold that sank beneath his flesh. He wasn't just wielding the light now. He was part of it. The next wave came, darker than the last. It struck with everything, the cloud itself roaring now, no longer pretending to be passive. It hated the light. Hated the symbol. Hated him. He roared back. The shield exploded outward, not as a dome but a storm. It hit the ash with such force that the sky cleared for a blink, stars bleeding through the black. The cloud screamed again, this time in retreat. It coiled, collapsed, then scattered like smoke on the wind. Silence dropped like a blade. Darren collapsed to his knees. The device dimmed. The villagers stared. Not one spoke. Not even Lyrie. He was gasping now, sweat pouring, eyes glassy. Something inside him had changed. Not broken but remade. Lyrie knelt, held his face in her hands. Her skin was cool. Steady. "You did it," she whispered. His voice came from somewhere far away. "I think I lost something." "What?" He blinked. A tear slid down his cheek. "I don't remember what her name was." The villagers gathered around, not cheering. Watching. Not just a man anymore. A living memory. A symbol made flesh. And overhead, the stars burned brighter as if the universe had opened one eye to watch what he might become next. The fire inside the temple hadn't yet died when the betrayal began to burn. Deep beneath the surface of Eloria, in the oldest chamber of the sacred grotto, the relic pulsed with a faint golden breath, still humming from Darren's defiance against the ash. Cracks had formed along the crystalline veins of the ceiling, a result of the energy clash, but the structure held for now. The walls whispered old names in an ancient language, their voices soft as wind through dying leaves. Darren sat alone in the center of the room, the light along his forearm dim but warm, wrapped in thought and fatigue. His skin still tingled from the strain. The spiral had begun to settle, not just onto his flesh but into it, threads of energy winding through his nervous system like roots searching for meaning. Every beat of his heart echoed deeper now, reaching places it had never known. But peace, if it ever came here, never lasted long. He didn't hear the elder until it was too late. The sound was subtle at first, stone shifting against stone, the whimper of heat rising from somewhere it shouldn't. Then the unmistakable crackle of flame, not kindled for warmth, but destruction. Lyrie burst through the corridor moments later, breath ragged, eyes wide with dread. "The vault's burning," she choked. Someone's inside." Darren rose without a word. They moved together, fast, down into the lower caverns where the walls curved tighter, where the air always felt heavier. Heat licked at the edges before they even reached the chamber. Inside, light danced madly, orange and violet, reflecting off shattered crystal and smoke. At the heart of it stood an elder. His robe was stripped of ceremonial glyphs, the stone mask cracked down the center. His hands were stained with soot, and in them, a hammer too old to be ceremonial, too worn to be new. The relic's twin, a dormant fragment once thought unresponsive, now lay shattered at his feet. He didn't look surprised when they arrived. "You were never meant to awaken it," he said. Darren stared, the taste of copper rising behind his teeth. "You did this." "I sealed it," the elder answered, "long ago, after the first human left." "Captain Ring," Lyrie whispered. The elder nodded. "He came uninvited. He brought power, yes, but also questions. Doubt. Division. We swore it would never happen again." No outsider should carry the light. Darren took a step forward, the glow on his arm flaring. So you tried to erase it. I tried to protect us, the elder snapped, voice sharp as fractured crystal. From your kind. From another savior born from war, not wisdom. From history repeating itself. Lyrie stepped between them. But when we cried out when the sky fell and our children begged for light, it wasn't you who stood. It was him. The elder looked away, but his silence was bitter. Faith in strangers is how empires fall? The ground shook beneath them. The chamber trembled. From behind the far wall, a wind began to seep, not air, but shadow, thick and cold, crawling across the floor like oil through bone. The ash had come deeper. It had found them. Darren turned, heart pounding. The breach was always a matter of time, the elder said. Now you'll see why trusting a human is folly. Darren moved toward the relic, but the elder lunged, hammer raised. There was no hesitation in his eyes now, just a final certainty. If he couldn't unmake the prophecy, he would unmake the vessel. The strike never landed. Lyrie stepped into its arc, her hand raised. The spiral's light leapt from Darren's skin to hers, reflected, mirrored, and with a flash like lightning through glass, the hammer dissolved midair, atomized in a heartbeat. The elder collapsed, not dead, but undone. His eyes filled with the horror of what he had tried to destroy. Not just the relic. Hope. The ash spilled into the room in waves now, curling upward along the walls, twisting toward the core of the chamber. The relic's light flickered, weakened from damage, from sabotage. Darren's breath caught. His knees buckled. The spiral dimmed. He fell to the ground. The cloud reached for him. And then Lyrie's voice pierced the dark, not in fear, but in song. Low. Trembling. Ancient. She knelt beside him, placed one hand on his chest, and the other over the spiral. The chamber answered. The floor trembled. A new light burst outward, wider, deeper, not gold now, but violet and white, wrapping around both of them. It wasn't only Darren bearing the light anymore. The legacy had found its other half. The ash recoiled. Screamed. And retreated for now. The chamber fell still. Darren opened his eyes to her face. You're connected, he breathed. Lyrie smiled, tears tracing the edge of her jaw. Not just to you, she whispered. To the memory. To the future. And somewhere far beneath the stone, the spiral burned bright once more. The wind wasn't whined anymore. It moved like breath through dying lungs, warm in places it shouldn't be, tasting of copper and endings. The sky above the cliffs had turned to bruised charcoal, pierced only by the shimmer of the spiral etched into Darren's skin. The ash cloud hung over the valley like a predator caught between hunger and fury, pulsing with tendrils that reached for everything sacred. It was coming faster now. Not creeping. Charging. And deep inside the heart of the relic, what was left of it, there was still one pulse. One last heartbeat. But using it would mean something else entirely. Darren stood on the ledge above the hollow, the winds ripping through his jacket, the golden bands across his arm now lit from within. The energy hummed louder than thought. It wasn't just power anymore. It was history. It was memory. It was every sacrifice the universe had demanded wrapped around his spine, digging in like roots. Behind him, the villagers gathered in silence, faces lit by fear and flickering torchlight. Children clung to robes. Elders muttered prayers that hadn't been spoken in centuries. Lyrie stood just a step behind him, and in her gaze was something he couldn't name. Not fear. Not love. Something heavier. He turned to her. His voice was hoarse. If I use it, I don't know what happens. She stepped forward, her hand brushing the edge of the spiral glowing on his chest. You've already changed. You know that. I don't know if I come back from this. And if you don't. He looked away, at the horizon where the ash clawed at the cliffside, tearing soil from stone, reducing trees to gray vapor in seconds. Then who protects you? She didn't blink. Her voice came low, warm as fire in the throat of winter. Maybe the stars will send another. But maybe this time, they already did. He felt it then, something in her touch, in the stillness that followed. A shift not in the air, but in him. A calm not born of peace, but of purpose. He nodded. Then walked toward the edge. The sky opened with a groan as the ash launched its final assault, a wall of living shadow surging up the cliff face like a tidal wave made of absence. Darren moved to meet it. Step by step. Each footfall echoed like thunder in a canyon long dead. The spiral flared, brighter than before. His fingers curled around the relic's core now fused into his forearm and it answered. Not with sound, but heat. Not pain, but memory. Faces. Names. His sister. Ring. Lyrie. The girl he once loved back on Earth who used to call him Starboy when he couldn't sleep. All of it surged into his chest. And the world slowed. He looked up, eyes burning gold, and whispered a word he hadn't spoken since the war. One last time. Enough. He raised his hand. The spiral unraveled, pouring out of him in waves like not just seen but felt, threading into the ground, the sky, the breath of the people behind him. The shield didn't form this time. It expanded. The wave hit the ash in mid-climb. And the cloud screamed. Not in sound, but with everything it had stolen. Lives. Joy. Pain. It coughed them all out in one terrible shriek before it began to break apart, particle by particle, turning from shadow to mist to vapor to nothing. The cliff shook. And so did Darren. His knees gave. His hands trembled. Light poured from his mouth in slow, soft pulses. Lyrie ran forward, calling his name, but even as she reached him, she knew. The spiral was fading. He looked at her one last time. And smiled. Not because he knew the ending. But because, for the first time in years, he understood why the beginning had mattered. And far above, where the sky had cleared, a single star blinked back into view. The moment the light rose, the sky forgot how to be dark. It began with a tremor, not from the ground but from within Darren. A low, resonant hum that vibrated beneath his ribs, expanding through bone, blood, memory. The spiral on his chest was no longer just a mark. It burned like a star trying to be born, pulsing with the full weight of every name he'd carried, every face he couldn't quite remember but still somehow loved. His veins shimmered gold, lit from the inside like strands of living fire. He could feel his heartbeat slower now, deeper, echoing across dimensions he couldn't name. The ash cloud loomed above, trembling as if it, too, could feel what was coming. He stepped forward. No armor. No weapon. Just the light, and the weight of everything he was becoming. The relic ignited. A pulse shot from his chest, not outward like a blast but inward, folding reality into the point of his heart, building pressure until the very air held its breath. Then, like the silence before a storm, everything paused. The world hung in that perfect, fragile second. And then... detonation. The light erupted not in a beam but a flood, a storm made of memory and truth and something older than both. It didn't strike the ash, it unraveled it. The cloud shrieked without a mouth, folded in on itself, and vanished piece by piece, like ink pulled back into the pen of creation. The trees it had touched bloomed again in moments. The earth beneath the village, once brittle and cracked, surged with green. Stones hummed. The sky cleared. But the light didn't stop. It kept going. It kept taking. Darren staggered, legs buckling beneath him. The energy was leaving too fast. Not just from the relic but from him. He saw flashes behind his eyes. Not memories. Moments. A hand reaching out through fire. A whispered laugh in a language he didn't speak but somehow understood. Ring's voice saying goodbye. His sister, somewhere back on Earth, blowing out candles on a cake. The first time he ever looked at Lyrie and thought maybe the universe got something right. Each flickered. Faded. He collapsed to one knee, breath shallow. The spiral flickered. His fingers trembled. Lyrie was already running. She screamed his name, but it barely reached him. The sky above now burned with gold, not fire but light, soft, and endless. And all around him, the land healed. The ash was gone. Cleansed. Banished. But something else had gone with it. Part of him. He felt it as he sank into her arms. Silence fell over the cliffs. A silence not born of fear but reverence. She held his face, searching his eyes. Darren. Stay with me. He tried to speak. No sound came. But his lips curled. Just enough. As if to say, I'm still here. For now. The chamber had grown quieter with each passing day, as if the stone itself had learned how to listen. Light filtered through crystalline arches in soft pulses, glowing not from any sun but from the slow, rhythmic breath of the world beneath. Outside, the cliffs had begun to bloom again, as if Eloria herself had paused her mourning long enough to remember how to live. But here, inside the sacred heart of the mountain, time moved differently. Lyrie hadn't left his side. She barely spoke. There were no prayers left to say, and none of the elders dared interrupt. Not anymore. They came only to bring water, or food she barely touched, and when they saw him lying motionless on the altar of memory, his chest faintly rising, the golden spiral etched across it like a relic of a war that had not yet finished, they whispered new names for him. She called him only one. Darren. His skin had paled, the glow beneath it soft now, no longer wild or consuming. The energy that once surged like a storm had settled into embers, quiet, buried deep. But it was still there. She could feel it each time her fingers brushed his, each time she placed a hand over his heart and waited not just for life, but for recognition. On the fourth day, his hand twitched. She didn't move at first. Didn't dare hope. But then his eyelids flickered. His breathing changed. And when his eyes finally opened, they weren't the same. He blinked against the light, slow and uncertain, and his gaze found hers like gravity had never let it go. You're still here, he murmured. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say everything. Wanted to scream, laugh, weep into the hollows of his shoulder. But instead, she nodded, and whispered, You didn't leave me a choice. He tried to sit up, but winced. His body had changed. Thinner, slower, but still whole. And marked. The spiral glowed faintly on his chest now, no longer burning, just present. Like a brand. Like a vow. What happened? He asked. You burned the sky, she said. And the cloud ran from it. He stared at her, the words slow to settle. He remembered the light. The pain. The moment the world stopped. But not everything. There were gaps now. A strange emptiness in the shape of people he could no longer name. He reached for them, but they stayed out of reach. I lost something, he whispered. She nodded. And gave something greater? He turned his head, saw the walls. New murals. The same ancient style, the same ochre and gold. But different stories. A figure standing at the edge of the cliffs. Arms open, light bursting from within. Beneath that figure his face. Not heroic. Not divine. Just human. He looked at the image for a long time. They really believe that's me, he said. They don't believe, she answered. They remember? And as the chamber pulsed around them in quiet reverence, Darren leaned back into the stone, the faint echo of his heartbeat sinking once more with the rhythm of a world that had finally learned to breathe again. And so, the man who wore a forgotten insignia walked into legend not with a crown, but with scars that glowed like starlight. He didn't save the world because he was chosen. He saved it because he chose not to run. What he gave that day wasn't just light. It was memory. It was hope. It was proof that sometimes, the universe doesn't send gods. It sends people flawed, broken, human who rise when no one else will. But the spiral hasn't stopped glowing. And the ash was only the first shadow. Because in the deepest corners of the stars, something else has awakened. And next time, the sky fire may not be enough. If you think this was the end, think again. Subscribe to Alien Chronicles. Because out here, in the dark, we're only just getting started.